In July 1942, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany clashed in a brutal struggle for control over the city of Stalingrad, now known as Volgograd, situated on the Volga River. What unfolded there not only changed the course of the war, but also showcased the determination, resilience, and strategic brilliance of the Soviet forces. By the spring of 1942, the stakes of World War II had escalated to unprecedented levels. The war, which had already ravaged much of Europe and the Pacific, now centered on the brutal confrontation between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. With Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, the Germans had initially planned for a swift victory, relying on their blitzkrieg tactics, lightning-fast, mobile warfare that combined tanks, infantry, and air support to overwhelm the enemy in a matter of days or weeks. These tactics had worked spectacularly well in the previous campaigns across Europe, and the Germans believed that the same strategy would bring them success in the Soviet Union. At the outset, the Wehrmacht achieved stunning success. In the first weeks, the Germans captured large swaths of Soviet territory, including the important cities of Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. Soviet defenses crumbled under the weight of the German assault, and millions of Soviet soldiers were either killed or taken prisoner. The Germans made rapid advances and seemed on the verge of achieving their ultimate objective, a decisive victory over the Soviet Union. However, as the Germans approached Moscow, their advance ground to a halt due to the harsh winter of 1941-42. The brutal conditions had exposed critical weaknesses in the Wehrmacht, with the Germans suffering heavy losses from both Soviet counterattacks and the cold. However, despite these setbacks, Hitler and the German High Command were determined to continue their campaign in the East, confident that they could eventually break the Soviet defenses and win the war. By early 1942, the Wehrmacht had regrouped, and its forces were reinforced and re-equipped. Hitler's strategy for the coming year was bold and ambitious. Recognizing that the Soviet Union's resources were spread thin across its vast territories, the German military planned to shift its focus southward. This shift would bring the Wehrmacht into direct conflict with the industrial heartlands of the Soviet Union, a region rich in resources that the Nazis hoped to seize. Key to this plan were the oil fields in the Caucasus, vital for fueling the German war machine. But there was another target: Stalingrad. Stalingrad, located on the banks of the Volga River in southern Russia, was an important city, founded in the early 20th century as Tsaritsyn. It was renamed Stalingrad in 1925 in honor of Joseph Stalin, who was rapidly consolidating his power within the Soviet Union. The city's industrial significance was immense. Stalingrad was a major hub for heavy industry, manufacturing military equipment, steel, and armaments crucial to the Soviet war effort. Its factories were among the largest in the Soviet Union, and its strategic location along the Volga River made it a key transportation and supply route linking the central and southern parts of the Soviet Union. Capturing Stalingrad would not only cut off vital transportation routes, but also cripple Soviet industry, thus weakening the Soviet military and war production. However, the city's symbolic importance far outweighed its industrial value. To the Soviet people, Stalingrad represented the heart of their resistance to the German invasion. The city's namesake, Joseph Stalin, was both a symbol of Soviet power and a highly controversial figure, and his association with Stalingrad made the city's defense a matter of national pride and survival. The city had already played a role in the Soviet Union's history of resisting foreign invaders, and its fall to the Germans would represent a crushing blow to Soviet morale, potentially leading to widespread defeatism and collapse. For Adolf Hitler, the capture of Stalingrad became a personal obsession, one that was driven by both military strategy and ideological motivations. He saw the city as a direct challenge to the power and authority of Stalin, and capturing it would not only destroy the Soviet Union's industrial and logistical capacity, but would also serve as a symbolic victory over the Soviet leader himself. The German obsession with Stalingrad also marked a shift in the nature of the conflict on the Eastern Front. While the Germans had initially focused on seizing key industrial and resource-rich areas, the capture of Stalingrad became the new priority. Hitler's personal fixation on the city caused him to lose sight of the broader strategic picture. On June 28, 1942, the Germans launched Fall Blau, or Case Blue, a massive summer offensive aimed at advancing through the southern Soviet Union. The offensive had two major objectives. The first was to push southward and seize the vital oil fields in the Caucasus, and the second was to take Stalingrad. The Germans were prepared to divide their forces, with General Erich von Manstein commanding the southern forces tasked with advancing into the Caucasus, while General Friedrich Paulus and his Sixth Army focused on Stalingrad. The early stages of the German advance were marked by rapid progress. The Soviet forces were in a state of disarray, still recovering from the shock of the previous years of conflict. The Germans were able to quickly push forward through the vast Russian steppes, with Soviet formations being encircled and destroyed in the process. However, despite the early success, the Germans were running into difficulties. The vastness of the Soviet Union, combined with the extended supply lines, created significant logistical problems. German forces were spread thin, and the reliance on their allies, Romanians, Italians, and Hungarians, left critical flanks vulnerable. These forces were ill-equipped and lacked the strength to withstand a determined Soviet counteroffensive. German forces were also operating at the edge of their supply range, and the further they pushed into the Soviet heartland, the harder it became to maintain their supply lines. Meanwhile, Stalin, recognizing the importance of Stalingrad and anticipating the German thrust, took preemptive action. He appointed General Andriy Yeryomenko to defend the city. Yeryomenko, a seasoned Soviet commander, was charged with organizing the defense of Stalingrad at all costs. Stalin's directive was clear. Stalingrad must not fall. The city was vital not only for its strategic location, but for its symbolic value. Its capture would send a clear message to the Soviet population and would demoralize the Red Army, whose morale had already been severely tested by months of brutal combat. By August 1942, as the German forces neared Stalingrad, the city, once an industrial powerhouse, was transformed into a battlefield. Entire neighborhoods were leveled. The bombing raids were meant to create chaos and panic, but the Soviets didn't buckle under pressure. The defenders and the civilians who remained in the city were determined to hold on. The streets of Stalingrad became a haunting scene of destruction. Buildings were turned into fortresses, and the urban landscape was littered with the wreckage of tanks, trucks, and debris from air raids. The fighting was often close quarters, with soldiers from both sides fighting for control of individual buildings or even rooms within those buildings. The city became a labyrinth of ruined buildings, basements, and alleys where fierce battles played out. Every inch of the city was contested, and both sides endured horrific casualties in the process. Snipers would pick off soldiers from opposite sides, while tank battles raged in the ruins. The constant bombardment, the smell of burning buildings, and the cries of the wounded created an atmosphere of overwhelming horror. Soldiers and civilians alike faced the brutal reality of the siege, with food, water, and medical supplies becoming increasingly scarce. With no way to break the encirclement, the Germans found themselves trapped in a war of attrition. By the end of 1942, Stalingrad had become one of the most heavily bombed and destroyed cities in history. The human cost of the battle was immense, with both soldiers and civilians enduring horrific suffering as they struggled for every inch of ground. As the Germans struggled to break through Stalingrad's defenses, the Soviets were meticulously preparing their counteroffensive, knowing that the German grip on the city needed to be broken to halt their advance and shift the momentum of the war. And while the Wehrmacht fought desperately in the streets, the Soviet leadership understood that defeating the Germans at Stalingrad required more than just holding the city. It required a coordinated and strategic counterattack that could inflict devastating losses on the German forces and cripple their ability to continue fighting. The groundwork for the Soviet counteroffensive was laid in the fall of 1942, as Soviet High Command, led by General Georgy Zhukov, began to carefully plan a strategy that could envelop and trap the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad. General Vasily Chuikov, who was overseeing the defense of the city, was tasked with holding the Germans in place within the city. preventing them from advancing while Soviet reserves were mobilized for the counterattack. The German forces, after months of bloody urban warfare and the relentless bombing campaign by the Luftwaffe, had extended their lines significantly. This created a vulnerability that the Soviets quickly identified. While the Germans were focused on pushing through the city's defenses, their flanks had become exposed. These vulnerabilities were the key to the Soviet plan, and Operation Uranus was born out of this realization. The operation aimed to exploit the weak points of the German flanks, particularly the Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian forces positioned to guard them. On November 19, 1942, after weeks of preparation, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive two-pronged pincer movement designed to trap the German Sixth Army. The operation was carefully timed, with the Soviet forces launching their assault from both the north and the south of Stalingrad, overwhelming the Romanian and Italian forces that had been tasked with securing the German flanks. These forces, ill-prepared and poorly equipped for the winter conditions, were swiftly overrun by the Soviet advance. The Germans, who had relied heavily on these auxiliary forces to secure their position, found their lines shattered. The Soviet forces, numbering close to 1 million men, moved swiftly and decisively. The attackers used their numerical advantage to push back the German defenses and cut through the flanks of the encircling forces. The precision of the attack and the speed with which it was carried out caught the Germans completely off guard. The Romanian and Italian forces, which had been positioned on the outer perimeter of the German front, were quickly overwhelmed. Within just a few days, the Soviets had effectively encircled the German Sixth Army, trapping it inside the city of Stalingrad. By November 23, 1942, the Soviet forces had successfully completed their encirclement. The once mighty Sixth Army, which had been poised for victory just weeks earlier, was now completely surrounded. The Germans were cut off from reinforcements, resupplies, and any hope of escape. The tactical brilliance of Operation Uranus left the Germans in a precarious situation with no clear way out. They were isolated in the city, facing destruction or capture. Despite the gravity of the situation, Adolf Hitler's reaction was one of denial. The Nazi leader, notorious for his unwillingness to accept defeat, refused to believe that the Sixth Army had been fully encircled. Hitler issued direct orders to General Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, demanding that he hold his position at all costs. Even as the situation grew more dire by the day, Hitler remained adamant that surrender was not an option. He believed that a surrender of the Sixth Army would deal a catastrophic blow to German morale and would have far-reaching consequences for the Nazi cause. As the encirclement tightened, the German soldiers inside Stalingrad faced increasingly dire conditions. Trapped in the freezing winter cold with no access to fresh supplies, the soldiers were forced to rely on airdrops from the Luftwaffe to sustain them. However, this effort was inadequate. The Soviet forces had gained control of the skies, and German planes attempting to deliver supplies were frequently shot down by Soviet interceptors. The Luftwaffe pilots could not keep up with the demands for constant airdrops, and as a result, the trapped German forces were left with dwindling supplies of food, ammunition, and medical resources. The soldiers of the Sixth Army, already worn down by months of intense fighting in Stalingrad, were now faced with the brutal reality of starvation and disease. The freezing winter conditions only made matters worse, with temperatures plummeting to horrific lows. The soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, and their hope for survival rapidly dwindling. With no way to break the Soviet encirclement and with supplies running dangerously low, the situation inside Stalingrad grew increasingly desperate. In their desperation to survive, the German soldiers resorted to horrific measures. They scavenged for whatever food they could find: rats, stray dogs, and even the bodies of fallen comrades. In some cases, the soldiers turned to cannibalism, driven to the edge of sanity by the overwhelming hunger and deprivation. The horrors inside the encirclement were unimaginable, and morale continued to plummet as the reality of their situation set in. As December 1942 drew to a close, General Paulus and his staff were increasingly aware that they had no hope of breaking the Soviet encirclement. Yet, despite the overwhelming evidence that surrender was the only option, Paulus remained under intense pressure from Hitler to hold out. Hitler's insistence that the Sixth Army fight to the last man only deepened the soldiers' suffering, as it meant that no surrender would be allowed, even in the face of certain destruction. By the end of January 1943, the situation inside the encirclement had become untenable. The German forces were on the brink of collapse, and General Paulus, realizing that continuing to fight would only result in more unnecessary deaths, was faced with a difficult decision. Finally, after weeks of refusing to surrender, Paulus was forced to accept the reality of the situation. On January 31, 1943, he officially requested a surrender. The formal capitulation came on February 2, 1943, when the German Sixth Army finally laid down their arms and became prisoners of war. More than 90,000 German soldiers, including wounded men, were taken prisoner by the Soviets. It was a massive blow to the German war effort, not only because of the loss of so many troops, but because the defeat shattered the myth of the invincible Nazi army. The Germans had been defeated by the Soviet Red Army, something many had thought impossible. General Paulus, who had been promoted to Field Marshal just before the surrender, became the first German Field Marshal in history to be taken prisoner. The victory at Stalingrad marked the first major defeat for Nazi Germany in the war. It was a turning point that shifted the momentum on the Eastern Front. From this point onward, the German forces would begin a long retreat from Soviet territory, and the Red Army would push westward, eventually making its way to Berlin in 1945. Stalingrad proved that the German war machine was not invulnerable, and that the Soviets, despite their early losses, were capable of defeating them. The cost of victory, however, was staggering. The Battle of Stalingrad was one of the bloodiest in history, with total casualties on both sides reaching over 1.4 million. The German lost an estimated 300,000 soldiers, while the Soviets suffered around 1.1 million casualties, including those killed, wounded, or missing in action. The impact of Stalingrad on the course of the war was profound. It marked a turning point that would shape the future of the Eastern Front and the entire war.